This podcast is produced by Defining Moments Canada for the Bryce 100 Project, which commemorates Dr. Peter Bryce's 1922 pamphlet and his role in bringing to public attention the atrocious health conditions for Indigenous children in residential schools. In exploring the commercial determinants of health and their impacts for and on Indigenous peoples, we continue to bring public attention to the factors that impact Indigenous health.
You're listening to Aanoodizewin, a podcast about the commercial determinants of Indigenous health. I am Bidase Kwe Nimki Beneshi Dodem Wikwem Kong Donjaba Nogo Jawaning Doda. I am Dr. Amy Shawanda. I'm a provost postdoctoral fellow at the Wakabiness Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto. And in each episode, we sit down with experts to talk about a different health-harming industry and how it intertwines with the legacies of colonization and Indigenous health. Today, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Daniel, who is non-Indigenous and a colleague and a friend of mine. And we're going to talk about how we came with the idea of Aanoodizewin and the podcast for the series. Hey, Daniel, let's chat about how we got into this. I know we come from pretty different worldviews, so it would be really good to give our listeners some context.
Hi, Amy. Yeah, this is exciting. My name is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. I'm very excited to be here. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Truthfully, I'd wanted to do something in the area of Indigenous health for some time, but it didn't seem like I had anything to add that people from the actual communities couldn't do any better. Yeah, because it is a privilege to be asked to work in the space of Indigenous health. And as you know, as an outsider, as a settler. So really leading up to this, I was sitting on the outside looking in, just trying to write out how some of my own primary work, this area of the commercial determinants of health, of tobacco and pharmaceutical industry policy, could do better around intersecting with Indigenous health. And it wasn't until I was invited in that I thought I should be doing much of this. But then secondly, I think the people that are close to me, around me, already know this about me, which is I truly can't stand the virtue signaling that's so ingrained, that feels to me so ingrained in academia. But I think I felt I was doing it too, with the land acknowledgements, the orange shirts, and the constant allusions to the need to address Indigenous health inequities in my classes. Not to say that those aren't important, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of that in comparison to actual action in academia, and I think I was doing that too a little bit. So, it is important to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous health, but it's something else to actually start doing something about it. So I guess the third piece, and it's related to that, is that I myself came into this area with a lot of hesitations, which is to say that I wasn't invited into these spaces until recently, which was actually probably a good reason not to get involved in a space where a lot of outsiders think they know best. But also, a feeling that probably well-intentioned settlers feel, which is that I do worry, or I have been worried about saying the wrong things in these spaces, especially as a white guy in this work. And I guess that's where working with you, Amy, has been especially helpful, partially because it was you who invited me to be involved in this podcast after the paper we wrote together, but also because I feel comfortable enough with you that I know you'll tell me if I'm saying something stupid, or just tell me to read up on something if I ask you something obvious. And really, more than that, most of our work together has been much more about talking about our personal lives and just talking than academia. So that's humanized the whole thing. So yeah, I think working with Amy, working with Dr. Shawanda, has informed how I think about my role in all this. And then lastly, just to round it out, I guess, truthfully, I do really believe in the importance of this stuff, in the importance of highlighting how health-harming industries impact communities made vulnerable by colonization. And I do think that's a lens that's been largely missing to date.
Aanoodizewin was meaning greed in general. I had this conversation with my auntie about how giving her what commercial determinants of health really talking this was an hour and a half conversation that I had with my auntie Rosalinda, and it was building off of what suggestions Daniel gave me, and I was like, I don't think those are going to work, Daniel, but let me run it by my mom and my aunt. So we had this conversation early on about, you can't really translate Indigenous health or health in Anishinaabemowin. So it took this really interesting turn about how Aanoodizewin greed really applies to commercial determinants of health. So sharing with Daniel my earlier suggestions, they were very long, 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 long names. And, Daniel, do you want to share with the audience about, or our listeners, about the words that you were suggesting?
Sure. So we were talking, I mean, Aanoodizewin captures a lot of what we were trying to, in that we're talking about more than just profit or the profit incentive. We're talking about a particular form of greed. But before this, I was throwing words out there. I was looking at Ojibwe dictionary and looking up how to talk about health, disease, profit, and in my poor knowledge was essentially trying to shove together words that did not work together, that literally didn't mean anything when Amy was talking to her mom and her auntie. So we landed on this as, firstly, we wanted to make sure that we were using Anishinaabe language and that we were not just trying to fit this into the standard language around the commercial determinants of health. And that also it articulated a type of greed rather than just a type of profit or an interest in money.
Yeah. And then like having this conversation around Kenagwage meaning everything is being destroyed as it's already happening on the earth. That's a really long sentence that I don't think many of our non-Indigenous viewers or listeners would be able to capture. And then also having this conversation with both my mom and my auntie, and we're talking about Jabo Gajigawan, Bimadzwit Aanoodizewin. Greed is taking over a person's life, like every aspect of one's life impacting their good life. And that was, looking at their mental health, their emotional health, their physical and their spiritual health as well. So, everything is being impacted by this greed. So we end up with Aanoodizewin, greed as in general, because it does impact us in every shape and form. So, really aligning yourself with the seven grandfather teachings and traditional teaching so that you stay away from greed.
Amy, as you can talk about, this is pretty far from the work you do.
Absolutely. I come at my research and my work coming from an Anishinaabe lens. I often look at it from looking at traditional practices, past, present, and future. What is resilient in our culture, looking at languages. My PhD focused on Anishinaabe motherhood and the resilience and resurgence of our contemporary mothers adapting those practices. So I am very interdisciplinary in the work that I do, and I do have an interest in many fields. So when you actually approached me to talk about commercial determinants of health and we had these conversations going, it really piqued my interest because this is some of the work that I have previously done, but I just never labeled it the commercial determinants of health. But, maybe that's something we can talk about now, is how you got into how you end up writing that paper and showing it to me.
Okay, well, Amy, I first want to start with this because this is how one of the first connections we had was talking about Amy as a very young person wrote this paper, I think in grade 4. Is that right? Grade 3, grade 4.
No, I would totally take that, but no, it was my undergrad paper.
Okay, so it's a little later on, but it's fine. Yeah, once you're this old, for me, like everyone's in grade 3 or 4. But the paper I think was called Follow the Money, and this was just out of a personal interest, this desire to look into profit and Indigenous health outside of any sort of specific curriculum. I think this was not really the specific assignment, but Amy was sort of subtly interested in this. And then how in universities we often like to we'll put everything into a label. So this thing, commercial determinants of health, that might not have been technically what Amy would have been labeled as, but was doing this work and was interested in this stuff. So as soon as Amy mentioned that really got us into a bigger conversation about all these topics. So do I have that right, Amy? Was that what the paper?
Yeah, it was about the residential school, and I didn't want to write about residential school. It is a heavy topic for Indigenous people to consistently write about. So I didn't want to write about the mental aspect or the physical aspects or even the historical aspect. So I approached it from a financial lens and who is funding these churches, who is funding who is funding the children to get there. So I was looking at it from that lens. And so I guess that did pique my interest at that point. And because nobody really looks at those financials, and because the paper that was asked of me at that time, I was like, I can't write another paper on residential school, and I refuse to at this point. So let's
Mm.
let's approach it from a different set of lens. And even though it was outside the scope, I actually did very well on that paper because I still talked about how those financial harms impacted our communities.
How did you go about, what did that research look like? What were you trying to find? Was this through
Um,
documents?
yeah, this was just before the TRC had published its many reports. These were stories that you were hearing in communities. So when I was looking at my undergrad work, it was looking at what was already published at that point in time. It was very limited in the reports and documentation, but what I did find was that it was funded by the government, and we already knew this in our story, but like just to find that factual information and back up our stories was
Mm.
very satisfying for me, because we talk about these stories in our communities, and then once we can find those reports and like say, see here, we told you, just like the 215 at the Kamloops residential school, like we knew about children never coming home, and we knew about all of these stories already. So when we have those stories come out in a very public way, we're like, we already knew this, and that's confirmation for us. So yeah, that's kind of
Mm.
my approach to that paper, and kind of the approach I take now is like, yes, we already have these stories there, and this is kind of what I do now.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a theme in this series where it's this, a lot of what we're talking about is this intersection between colonization, the residential school system, a lot of these big forces that we are aware of, but we often don't think about how those intersect with the profit motive or with general political economy lenses. And so I think as we get into this, whether we're talking about residential school systems or tobacco, there's often this interplay where, for the most part, money is an important, this is really where the commercial determinants of health is rooted. Money is an important thing to study. Profit is an important thing to study if you want to understand the social and political forces behind a lot of health issues. And often we need to see this through a failure of, let's say, the nation state, or failure of government intersecting with a whole bunch of other forces. So if we'll be talking about tobacco, but let's say when we get into this loss of traditional tobacco, which we'll touch on in other podcasts, and this loss of this general intergenerational loss of traditions that came from colonization, that intersected directly with the use of tobacco as a cash crop, and the use of tobacco as a way to almost co-opt Indigenous identity. So often you need these different lenses to truly understand where these are coming from. And so the same thing, the residential school system, I think, without that financial backing with the government, may still have existed through different religious forces, but that's an important determinant of it that often does get overlooked. These were not just happening, these were not just being done voluntarily. There was a financial backing behind all of this.
Yes, absolutely. And also, like, thinking about the introduction, when we talk about commercialization, Hudson's Bay Company was the first introduction to Canada. And I was just doing some recent readings and looking at Edward Benton Beneba. He talked about the teachings and the seventh fire, but he also talked about how the explorers at that time were first introduced to Anishinaabe. So when I was thinking about my historical relationship with Hudson's Bay, it goes all the way back to that first contact when they
Mm.
started putting up those posts and doing the trade and really impacting our ways of life. So that's coming back to the essence of this podcast of Aanoodizewin, is really looking at that greed. Initially, we are very thankful for the axes and all of the steel that came and helped us with technology that we were using, and that we were using at that time. Was that introduction. We were grateful for it. We were thankful we engaged in trade. But then when you introduce this moneyed economy system, we had no knowledge of that because that isn't our way of life. And so we often bartered and trade, or we did services of other things. So yeah, definitely a different way of looking at
Mm.
things, which when I think of these past historical stories and looking at where we are today, it just really comes into this full circle of where Indigenous people are today.
I think also the Hudson's Bay Company example is particularly relevant because they were able to sort of fill a gap in economic opportunities that the generally the nation state, the state of Canada, was not offering. And that's going to come up in different examples here, where when you look at, let's say, Indigenous led tobacco, that often is in absence of other economic opportunities. And so it requires a complexity in terms of the way we understand this. The Hudson's Bay Company actually was, for plenty of Indigenous and Anishinaabe people, quite important as a form of trade and as a form of economic resources. But that needs to be understood in the context of a bigger failure from government, from the nation state in offering other opportunities. So often these have to be understood basically in intersection. Amy, one thing that you and I have chatted about a bit is this co-opting of Indigenous traditions. That's really clear in tobacco, this use of Indigenous imagery and all these we'll talk more about it, but these association of sort of natural tobacco and how that gets connected to Indigenous imagery. But you also talked a little bit about how this is happening with cannabis, and that you had noticed that with cannabis, even with food at powwows. That was actually how we started a lot of these conversations, where Amy was just talking about personal experiences outside of any sort of big academic theoretical framework, and just seeing this on the ground of how things go from quite clearly non-traditional and get sort of subsumed into what we consider traditional practices. Would you say I have that right, Amy?
Yeah. And, taking an recent example, I just shared with a class I was teaching about Pepsi. And Pepsi is it's almost our cultural icon. You see it in beadwork, you see it in paintings, you see it happening in all of these shapes and forms, which is really interesting because it's not our traditional way. It's actually very harmful to our communities. It's not in a way that, like, it causes diabetes, it really impacts, but yet it's this cultural icon in it. And it blows my mind because I'm like, yes, Pepsi is cheaper to purchase, more than, like, a lot cheaper than water. So
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't communities members buy into that?
Mm-hmm.
Also, I noticed this when I went down to Mexico. I was looking at the prices of food, and water was much more expensive than a bottle of Coca-Cola. And when I went down to New Zealand, it was the same there. I had a friend that was in France just recently. I'm like, can you take a picture of a bottle of water and a bottle of pop for me? Because I really want to see the differences. She's like, sure. And so she sent it over to me. And again, the pop and the water were equally the same price, but not much of a difference. And I think we could see that here in Canada. It is slightly cheaper, but I mean, if your option is, if you're on a First Nation and you don't have drinkable water, your option is pop, and you can have access to that water. So you're really limited in the options that you're given. And so, I'm thinking of families that are on social assistance, and what are they going to purchase? Because, like, they don't have that nutritional education. So, many of these families are on survival. And so, like, what can they do? They can't really do a lot. So education in these realms, especially like this podcast, will help maybe understanding, like maybe trying to find ways to drink water as opposed to buying into those products like Pepsi and things like that. So, like, when I'm at powwows too, it's really interesting because tacos are not, like, the Indian tacos originally were survival food for us. We learned to make, we were given bread, lard, salt, sugar. We learned to make a meal out of that. We put that together and it was survival food into the generations. And now it's almost celebrated. Yes, it was a tool for colonization and destruction for our communities, but it was just like, here are scraps for you guys to fight over. And then when we were given that, we are like, okay, well, we got to make do what with we got. We got to survive this. And then so at powwows, it's being sold, and people are buying it, and it has this complicated historical tendency tied to it, but also like this love, like our ancestors survived on this. So, we
Mhm.
celebrate it today as well. So, it's this very complicated relationship with products. And when you look at the history of things like tobacco and alcohol, it has these. I've seen alcohol used as a medicine, but that's used in a respectful way, giving, it can be used as medicine, such as like wounds, cuts, and things like that, as disinfectants, but it's not meant to be abused. I mean, you see communities having to struggle because they have no coping mechanism. I'm not talking for like all of them, but there is a good majority of people that don't have those coping mechanisms in place. So same with tobacco. When I was sharing with Daniel that I did this paper, again, it was looking at the historical significance of Indian heads on our communities. And so that also brought into this conversation the traditional uses and this really long, complicated history of tobacco and tobacco wars and honoring. And, you see these mascots in sports teams today, and it all stemmed from that Indian head, the wooden Indian head that would say, hey, this is where you can buy tobacco. And again, tying that in, we see these with the regulation of tobacco when it became legal here in Canada. The pop-up smoke shops were almost on every reserve, and a lot of them don't there are very few that don't have them, and purposely, because they don't want that business in their community. It is not traditional to our communities. However, our communities need to survive, so they are buying into the cannabis movement and selling it. So it's very complicated. I see it as a survival tactic, but also as like we need to evolve too.
Mm. You've also talked about how, even with bottled water, that you prefer the taste of bottled water because of an absence of safe, clean drinking water growing up. And then, ironically, or paradoxically, you end up preferring the taste of water that's often being extracted from Indigenous lands and then given to you in bottled water form in the absence of clean, safe public drinking water. And then it's become your taste buds actually prefer that. So even when you have some access to safe, clean drinking water, you prefer bottled water. So would you say I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the conditioning of my taste buds, right? Like here in Peterborough, there is actually this story about Doug Williams-Baugh, who just recently passed, and a mentor of mine, and he would talk about the flowing of the water, how water is treated here in our communities. And we have a water treatment plant in my community, and seeing how it operates, and living here in the city, hearing these stories about water treatment. And so it really had me questioning things like, there are some days or weeks the water tastes just like chlorine, and it'll be like that for a long period of time, where I don't want to drink just water that tastes like chlorine. So I do prefer certain bottles of water if I
Mm.
can buy water that is going to go back into First Nations. I know that's very rare, but if you can find those ones, it is preferable. And, I stay away from Nestle products because of what they have done to our communities. So I am anti Nestle products for water. I know Nestle is a much bigger entity than just bottled water. They sell chocolate bars and they sell this and that and the other. So, I am very mindful in the products that I do purchase. But yes, absolutely right in that aspect that, my kids always joke around. They picked up my language. Is like, oh my God, did you spill the expensive water? And because they'll say that to me, Mom, that's the expensive water you spilled. I'm like, I know. And it's just because it is expensive, and I do value it to a certain degree, where, water is life, and we do have those teachings that are connected to water. So I am trying to show them the importance of it. But yes, I do have access to water, and unfortunately it tastes like chlorine most of the time here.
I mean, I'm Jewish, so we have a similar thing with spilling expensive club soda. So there's some similar dynamics there. Uh, so I think that some of this actually speaks to a broader theme of this podcast, which is that these are complex, and it's not always going to be evil corporation, indigenous communities that have no sovereignty, have no self-determination. Often there are all these other factors. For Amy, drinking bottled water is not simply just like a corporate ownership over her taste buds, but actually it intersects with failures of the public system. And hopefully through the podcast, we're going to outline this complexity and avoid reductive or simplistic views of these topics.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing. I hope that everybody is interested in this podcast, and we hope that you join us in the following podcast themes of alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, ultra-processed food, and baby formula, and that you're able to walk away with some educational materials at the end. So we look forward for you tuning in next episode.